This video is going to give you strategies for writing a metaphor poem. Now, there are lots of different types of metaphor poems and lots of different ways to write them. This isn't the only way, this is just a tutorial to get you started. For this one, I have two example poems that both have a metaphor. The first one you've probably heard a lot in class is The Rose That Grew from Concrete. And we've read this one so many times, I'm not going to reread it, but I want to remind you this one had a metaphor. It's talking about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete, and we have later discovered that he is the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete. So every time it's talking about the rose, it's really talking about the author. So the rose is the author. The rose is a metaphor for how he was successful, even though his life situation did not set him up for success. Likewise, we have this poem over here from Dan Gerber. You might not have heard this one as much, so I'm going to do a quick reread and we'll highlight the metaphor. This one is called Advice. You know how after it rains, my father told me one August afternoon, when I struggled with something hurtful my best friend had said, how worms come out and crawl all over the sidewalk, and it stays a big mess a long time after it's over, if you step on them. Leave them alone, he went on to say, after clearing his throat, and when the rain stops, they crawl back into the ground. So in this one, the metaphor is all these worms that come out and crawl all over the sidewalk, and if you step on them, they turn into a big mess. But if you leave them alone, they crawl back into the ground. So these worms come out because of the rain and they're crawling on all over. And if you walk all over them, it's gross. You squish them. And if you just wait, they'll go back into the ground and it'll be okay. But he's not really talking about worms. What he's really talking about is that hurtful thing that her friend had said. That's the worms. And somebody says something hurtful and you can swirl on it and rethink it over and over, and it turns into a great big mess because you spend so much time and energy. You let it hurt so much more. But if you give it time and you don't stress over it and spiral over it, and you don't go yelling at your friend over it, those angry feelings can go back into the ground, and then you can talk about it rationally and get it solved. So in both of these poems, the author is talking about something. In the first one, they're talking about a rose growing from concrete. In the second one, they're talking about worms coming out on a rainy day. But that's not really what the poem is about. It's a metaphor for something else. And so that's the type of poem we're going to work on today. This is a challenging poetry type, and I'm excited that you're trying it out. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we have to start brainstorming. And my suggestion, again, it's not the only way, but my suggestion is to think about experiences that have been powerful for you. So things you've seen and noticed and thought, hey, that was really interesting. And so I had some examples. And here are my examples. The first one is, it's been snowing where I'm at, and I'm so interested in the way the snow falls and it just covers up everything. So as it's snowing, I watch the snow cover up. Doesn't matter what's outside. It could be a big fallen tree, it gets covered in snow. It can be a pile of gravel covered in snow, which is really cool. Another thing that I noticed is that in wintertime, when I look up, the stars shine so brightly when it's really cold outside. It's like the cold air makes them seem brighter. I thought that was really interesting. And then I've been thinking about plants starting to grow in the spring, and I thought about how I can have a packet of seeds inside and it does nothing, but when I put it in the ground with water and the right temperature, it magically knows to grow. And then I was at the store the other day and there was a goldfish in a tank and it just swam around over and over in the same small tank as if everything it saw was new. And I thought that was really interesting. So these are my experiences that felt kind of powerful lately. So I encourage you to take a few minutes and think about some experiences that seemed really powerful to you. Go ahead and pause the video if you need more time. All right, so once you've got those experiences listed, I'll bring those back. There we go. You're going to start to think about what those experiences could represent. What is another thing you could say when you thought of that experience? You're like, hey, that's kind of like. And so you're going to start listing those ideas underneath. So, for example, my first one about the snow falling and then covering up everything, I thought that kind of feels like when people say they're sorry and it feels like it covers up the problem, but they're not going to really change. It just hides the problem. So if they say, "Oh, I'm really sorry," but they're going to call you a name again, they're not trying to change. It's like when the snow falls on the ground and it's all dirty and it looks better for like 2 days, and then the snow melts, and then the problem is still there. Sometimes it's even worse. I tried to think of ideas for this next one, for the stars shining their brightest, and I just didn't have any. And that's okay. I just didn't have any. And then I thought about the seeds growing, and then I thought about seeds are kind of like people, and how people might seem like they're not growing and changing and getting better until the conditions are right. So maybe you're having a hard time in math and you don't get it, and then you get into a small group and it suddenly starts to make sense. Or the teacher gives you uh, pattern blocks and you can build what you're trying to do, and you're like, oh, I get it now. Just like a seed that needed water and temperature change, maybe a person needs just the right conditions. And then I thought about the goldfish in his tank, and I thought, you know what? That goldfish seems really happy because he doesn't know any better. Sometimes I think we seem really happy swimming around in our tiny tank because we don't know any better. We're just like the goldfish. So then that's what you're going to do next. You're going to think about those powerful experiences you had and then say, how could this connect to a real life experience? How could this be connected to something that I want to say, a message that I want to say about life? So take a couple minutes and try those out and then restart the video when you're ready. All right, so now you've done all this thinking and your job is to choose one of them. So thinking about these ones, I know I don't want to write about the stars because I didn't have an idea, but I think I really like this idea of the snow falling and covering things and how it's like a metaphor for apologies when they're not going to change. So that's the one I'm going to work on. I'm going to cross out the others so I don't get distracted. But you know, I kind of like the goldfish one. Maybe I'll write a poem about that later. But for now, I'm going to focus on the snow. And so I need to do some more poetry thinking before I'm ready to draft. I want to think about imagery that could make my metaphor feel more real. And I want to think about tone, like how I want to say my poem, how I want to feel as I'm writing my poem. So first, I'm going to think about imagery. And here are some of my imagery thoughts. I thought the snow could almost be like downy feathers. I think about when you have those big clumps of snow that fall together, they almost look like feathers, and down is like the little baby fluff feathers that birds have when they're little, so downy feathers. I also thought how when it's shimmery, it's almost like a pearl, so maybe I want to describe it as pearly white. Um, when it starts to fall on the ground, it piles up, and I wanted to describe it as frosty hills. I kind of want to lean into the coldness of the snow because I feel like when somebody says they're sorry, but they're not doing anything about it, it's kind of cold. And so then I added this, stealing my warmth. Those apologies where somebody goes, sorry, but they don't really mean it. They almost leave you feeling worse than if they hadn't said anything. And then for tone, this isn't going to be a happy poem. I'm not comparing it to happy things. I'm comparing it to frustrating things. So I tried to list words about like, what would be words I would use for somebody who says they're sorry, but they're not. And so I had words like deceptive, tricky, deceitful, fake, or lazy. Those words all reveal my tone that I am not happy with this snow that covers stuff up but doesn't really solve anything. All right, now that I've got all this brainstorming done, I'm ready to compose my poem. When you have your brainstorming done, go ahead and restart the video and you can start composing your poem with me. So the first step is to write the sentence to introduce your metaphor. First, I like to write it like a sentence and then I'll break it up into poetry lines. Sometimes it's hard to know how to start your sentence, so I've got a couple sentence starters right down here. When I think about the rose that grew from concrete, I feel like this one. Have you heard about, because that's how he starts, have you heard about the rose growing from a crack in the concrete? You could also use a starter like, have you ever seen, or I've been thinking about. Now again, these aren't the only ways to start. They're just suggestions to get you going if you're having a hard time getting started. I think I'm going to use I've been thinking about. And my sentence is, I've been thinking about how the snow falls on the dirty, messy ground and covers it all up. And so I started with my sentence. Then I want to break it up into lines. And so I just kind of thought, where would I want to pause? What would feel poetic to me? And so I wrote, I've been thinking about how the snow falls on the dirty, messy ground and covers it all up. After that step, I'm ready to start adding in that imagery and tone, those imagery and tone ideas that I came up with. So for imagery, I had ideas like downy feathers and pearly white, piling up in frosty hills and stealing my warmth. And so I'm just going to go in and add those. I'm going to draw a line here so I can really focus here on my poem. And I skipped lines so I'd have room to go back in and add things. So let's see here. I've been thinking about how the snow falls in downy feathers on the dirty, messy ground, piling up in frosty hills. And covers it all up. Yeah, I like that. Now, did I use all of my ideas? I did not. I used this one and I used this one. I can hang on to the other two. Maybe I'll want to use them later in my poem, or maybe they just didn't fit and these are the ones I liked. Next, I'm going to look at my tone words and think, which of these do I want to include? I really like lazy because I feel like when people say they're sorry but they're not going to change, it feels lazy. So I've been thinking about how the lazy snow falls in downy feathers on the dirty, messy ground, piling up in frosty hills and covers it all up. Ooh, maybe I want to say piling up in fake frosty hills, because they're not really hills, it's just snow. So maybe I want to add that in there, piling up in fake frosty hills. So take a couple minutes and go in now that you've got your sentence. It's broken up into lines, and see how can you add your imagery and your tone words. Go ahead and restart the video after you've added those. All right, so there was my original sentence. I'll draw my line again, and then I went back and typed up those things that I added so it's easier to see. And so right now I've been thinking about how the lazy snow falls in downy feathers on the dirty, messy ground, piling up in fake frosty hills and covers it all up. And then the next part is I want to connect it to what it represents. And so I said I wanted it to represent when people make apologies without change and how that just hides the problem. So I'm going to compare it to what I'm teaching. And if you're feeling stuck, a good starter is it's sort of like. And so I said, it's sort of like an apology where they say they're sorry, but they don't really intend to change. So in this first stanza here, you're saying the experience and you're using your imagery and you're using your tone. In the next stanza, you're telling what it represents. So my imagery and my metaphor is all about the snow, but it really means an apology where they're not going to change. And then after that, you're going to give your final words. And there's lots of ways you can do that. You could finish the metaphor. So for mine, I'm talking about the snow falling, but I haven't said what happens after. So I could finish the metaphor and say what happens after the snow falls. Or you could tell how you feel. Maybe I'm going to say they both leave you feeling icy and alone. Or you're going to tell how it ends. Maybe you have a different ending idea. I think for me, I want to finish the metaphor. I really want to show that image of the snow melting away and leaving the ground just a muddy mess, just like when the apology melts away and the friendship is even more damaged than before because they didn't even really mean that they were sorry. So I wrote, when the snow melts away, the ground is muddier than before. Go ahead and pause the video and think to yourself For stanza 2, what does it connect to? What can you write about what it represents? And then for the final stanza, give your final words, either by finishing the metaphor, or telling how you feel, or maybe you have a different idea. Finally, you're on to the last step. Oops, there we go, where you're looking at your completed poem and looking for ways that you can improve it. So as you reread, there are some things you can look for. You can look for words that you repeated that you didn't mean to repeat. Maybe it was boring and you wanted to change one of those repeated words. Maybe you had boring words that you wanted to improve. Like for example, I have the word covers it all up. I think, maybe covers is boring. What could I say instead? Maybe I want to think about that. You could look for places where you could add more imagery or more details. And then another thing you can do is you can look through and say, are there any long lines that you wish you had split up and you want to split them up into more lines? Are there stanzas that you want to separate? Maybe you have a big stanza and you want to separate it into two. Maybe you have too many stanzas and you want to put it back together. I'm debating if I want this to be split up into this many stanzas or put back together. I also don't really like the way this one is split up. I think I might put it back together. Another thing you can change is capitals. I think I want this to be a capital H. I want to show I'm starting a new idea. Maybe this one I don't want a capital here because it's like a continuation of a sentence. So I can go through and change capitals to show am I starting a new idea or continuing an old one. And you can also think about punctuation. Do I want punctuation? Like commas. See, I've got commas here. Or do I want to take those away? Do I want periods at the end of every stanza? Do I not want them? So this is the last step. You're going to go back and reread and think about how do you want to revise your poem? How do you want to change the words you used or the way it's written? All right, this is a really challenging poetry type, and I'm really glad that you decided to give it a try. I can't wait to read your metaphor poems.